In the quiet heart of Chicago, behind the stained glass windows of a respected church, a nightmare was unfolding. A man of God, adored by his congregation, and his long-term partner, seen as devoted fathers, were hiding a secret so vile it would shock the entire city. For nearly a decade, their adopted son lived in a prison disguised as a home, until the day he finally spoke out. Sometimes, the most disturbing crimes don't always hide in dark alleys or shadowy backstreets. They take place in the very places we are taught to trust: homes, churches, and families. This case forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. How far can manipulation go when the abuser wears the mask of morality? How many warning signs are overlooked because we trust the person showing them? It's a story of betrayal, power, manipulation, and the long journey to justice, one that will haunt Chicago's history for decades. Before we begin, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the deep dive crime stories we uncover here. If you believe in giving a voice to the voiceless and exposing the truths that others hide, this is the channel for you. Now, let's get into today's story. Chicago's West Side is a place of contrasts, a patchwork of old brick churches and bustling street markets, of children playing on cracked sidewalks just a block away from the sound of sirens. But tucked between two quiet residential streets stood Grace of Mercy Church, its tall steeple rising above the neighborhood like a watchful guardian. The church was known for more than its Sunday services. It was a community hub, a safe place where people came for food drives, counseling, and the comforting voice of the man who led it all, Pastor Michael Harrington. Michael was, by all outward appearances, the very definition of a devoted shepherd. At 48, he carried himself with a calm authority. His salt and pepper hair gave him an air of wisdom, and his deep, resonant voice had a way of making every sermon feel personal. He spoke not just from scripture, but from lived experience, or so his congregation believed. He could quote a verse one moment and share a humorous personal story the next, making even the most reserved churchgoer feel welcome. But Michael wasn't alone in his ministry. His long-term partner, Daniel Scott, 46, was the music director, a man whose soft-spoken nature balanced Michael's commanding presence. Daniel had an easy smile, a gentle laugh, and a way of making people feel at ease. On Sundays, his fingers would dance over the piano keys, filling the sanctuary with the kind of music that made people close their eyes and sway without realizing it. Together, Michael and Daniel were the heart of Grace of Mercy Church. They were also, to many in the neighborhood, a symbol of progress. An openly gay couple leading a thriving congregation was unusual, especially in a community that straddled traditional values and modern inclusivity. Yet Michael's charisma and Daniel's warmth seemed to win over even the most skeptical parishioners. It wasn't just that they were leaders, they were seen as role models. When they adopted a boy in 2008, the congregation celebrated it as another act of love and service. His name was Evan Harrington, an 8-year-old with shy eyes and a tentative smile. Evan had spent years drifting through foster homes, never staying long enough to call any place his own. Michael and Daniel's adoption of him was framed as a rescue, a chance for a child who had known instability to finally have a forever home. Michael often shared the adoption story during sermons. He would stand at the pulpit, place a hand on Evan's shoulder, and say, "This is what God calls us to do, to care for the least of these, to open our homes and our hearts." The churchgoers would nod, some even wiping away tears. Daniel would stand a few steps away, smiling proudly as if the moment were too personal to interrupt. Evan quickly became part of the church's fabric. On Sundays, he could be seen helping set out hymnals before service or sitting in the front pew between Michael and Daniel. At church picnics, he ran around with other kids, laughing and playing tag, though he was quieter than most boys his age. People chalked it up to shyness or the adjustment to a new life. From the outside, it was a heartwarming picture: two loving fathers, a rescued child, and a community that embraced them. But pictures can be deceiving. What no one saw, not the neighbors who waved when they passed the Harrington Scott home, not the church members who praised Michael's sermons, not even the close friends who shared Sunday dinners, was that behind the front door of their tidy two-story house, the story was far more complicated. The Harrington Scott household operated on a set of rules that seemed, at first glance, like any other family's: chores to be done, homework to be completed, curfews to be followed. But in reality, those rules were more about control than structure. Evan's life was monitored closely, his movements accounted for at all times. Friends were limited. Phone calls were brief and often on speaker. Even small acts of independence, like walking home from school alone, were discouraged. For a boy who had never known lasting stability, Michael's discipline might have felt, at first, like care. Daniel's quiet reinforcement of those boundaries may have seemed like agreement. But in time, those boundaries would tighten into something suffocating. Still, in these early years, nothing outwardly sinister appeared to the public. Michael's sermons grew more popular, Daniel's music more celebrated, and Evan's place in their family seemed secure. In the church bulletin, their family photo. Michael in his crisp black suit, Daniel in his neatly pressed shirt, and Evan in a blue sweater vest, was the very image of grace and goodness. But the thing about images is that they only show what people want you to see. And in this case, what the world saw was a carefully crafted mask, one that would not crack until years later, when Evan's truth would shatter the illusion forever. The first signs that something wasn't right in the Harrington Scott household didn't come in the form of shouting matches or sudden outbursts. They came quietly. So quietly that, at first, even Evan didn't realize they were signs at all. It began when Evan turned 13, a milestone that Michael Harrington made a point to celebrate. There was a small dinner at home, just the three of them. Daniel baked a chocolate cake. Michael gave Evan a leather-bound journal and a fountain pen, telling him it was time to start recording his thoughts like a man. On the surface, it was the kind of gift a thoughtful father might give. But as the days passed, Michael began using that phrase, like a man, more often. Sometimes it came during harmless advice about doing chores or helping at church. Other times, it slipped into conversations that made Evan's stomach tighten. Michael would invite him into the study late at night, after Daniel had gone upstairs. The study smelled faintly of old books and the strong coffee Michael drank even after midnight. Evan would sit on the leather chair across from the desk while Michael talked about responsibility and trust. At first, it was about schoolwork, keeping his grades up, being respectful. But soon the talks shifted. Michael began telling Evan that part of becoming a man was learning to be comfortable in his own body, and open to new experiences. The words were vague enough to pass for life lessons, but the tone, the lingering looks, felt different. Daniel, though less direct, played his own role. On Saturday mornings, when Michael was out meeting with church elders, Daniel would find reasons to talk to Evan about trusting your family, and keeping what happens in this house private. He said it casually, smiling as if it were nothing more than a household rule, but it was said often enough that Evan began to take it as an unspoken command. By the time autumn rolled around, Evan noticed something else: he was seeing less of his friends. Invitations to sleepovers were quietly declined by Michael, who would say, "We have church in the morning, son," or "I need your help around the house." At first Evan thought it was about keeping him focused, but gradually he realized he wasn't even allowed to spend much time with other kids after school. Even within the church, his freedom shrank. He was no longer asked to help set up for events with the other youth volunteers. Instead, Michael kept him close, assigning him small tasks that always placed him within arm's reach. Whether it was arranging hymnals in the front pews or carrying supplies from the basement storage, Evan was never far from either Michael or Daniel. It was subtle, but effective. The more isolated Evan became, the more his world shrank to just the three of them. And when your world shrinks, your sense of normal shifts. Michael's late-night talks became more frequent. Sometimes Daniel would be there too, leaning casually against the desk, nodding along to Michael's words about loyalty and not letting outsiders interfere in family matters. Evan didn't argue. He wasn't even sure what he would argue about. It wasn't like they yelled at him or threatened him outright, it was all framed as love, guidance, and protection. And for a boy who had been bounced from one foster home to another, that kind of stability, even if suffocating, was hard to let go of. The real crack. The first that would stay with him long after, came one winter evening. It was snowing outside, the city blanketed in white, and the church had cancelled evening service. Michael called Evan into the study again, telling him that being 13 meant they needed to start talking about manhood in a deeper way. That conversation didn't cross any obvious lines, not yet, but it left Evan unsettled. Michael spoke about boundaries, but in a way that seemed to erase them rather than build them. He said things like, "Trust means there's nothing you can't share with me," and, "Some things we talk about are just for us, not for Daniel, not for anyone else." Evan nodded because that's what was expected. But later that night, lying awake in bed, he thought about how strange it was that a father would want to keep secrets from his own partner. It would be months before Evan realized these talks were laying the groundwork for something far darker. For now, it was just a faint discomfort, a shadow at the edge of an otherwise perfect family portrait. But shadows, when ignored, have a way of growing. As Evan entered his late teens, the situation escalated. Michael's bonding sessions became increasingly physical, and Daniel's participation grew more direct. They controlled nearly every aspect of Evan's life, his phone, his friendships, even his access to the internet. Michael used his position as both father and pastor to guilt Evan into compliance, framing the abuse as God's way of keeping the family united. Isolation became a tool of control. Evan stopped participating in extracurricular activities, avoided friends, and rarely left the house except for church events. To outsiders, he seemed shy. Inside the home, he was trapped. Publicly, Michael and Daniel were pillars of the community. They hosted charity drives, visited sick parishioners, and mentored young men from the church. Evan was always by their side in public. Smiling in family photos, attending church banquets, and sitting in the front pew every Sunday. No one questioned his quiet nature. No one suspected the truth. This dual life allowed the abuse to continue unchecked for years. Michael and Daniel's positions of trust became their shield. By the time Evan turned 19, he had endured years of manipulation and abuse. But the turning point came one evening in 2019. After an argument over his plans to attend college out of state, Michael insisted Evan join him in his study for a serious talk. Daniel joined shortly after. The confrontation escalated, and for the first time, Evan pushed back, verbally and emotionally. The resistance sparked Michael's anger, and what followed was another episode of abuse. This time, however, Evan felt something shift inside him. He realized that if he didn't leave now, he might never escape. The very next morning, Evan waited until Michael and Daniel left for a church leadership meeting. He quickly packed a backpack and walked out of the house without looking back. He went straight to the apartment of his friend Tyler Green, who noticed Evan was visibly shaken. After hours of coaxing, Evan told Tyler the truth. Shocked and horrified, Tyler convinced him to go to the police. That evening, Evan sat in a small room at the Chicago Police Department, speaking with Detective Carla Mendoza and Detective Robert Hayes. He described years of abuse in painstaking detail, providing dates, descriptions, and incidents that lined up with church events and family trips. "It started when I was about 13. Michael would call me into his study late at night. At first, it was just him talking about being a man, about loyalty. But then, he started touching me. At first, it was on my shoulder or my back, but then, it became more. He said it was normal, that it meant we were close as father and son. He looked down, his voice breaking. By the time I was 15, he wasn't just touching me anymore. He'd make me sit on his lap, and then he'd do things to me. And Daniel would come in and join. They'd say I was lucky to have two people to teach me. Sometimes they'd make me do things to them, and if I said no, Michael would remind me that no one else wanted me before they did. That I'd go back to foster care if I didn't obey. Hayes exchanged a glance with Carla but let Evan continue. It happened in their bedroom, in the study, sometimes in the church office after hours. They'd lock the doors. Michael would pray over me first, like it was some blessing, and then, it would happen. I felt trapped, like there was no way out. I thought, maybe this is what family is supposed to be. Carla's voice was steady but kind. You did the right thing coming here, Evan. None of this is your fault. Not a single part. Evan finally looked up, tears in his eyes. I couldn't live like that anymore. I had to get out. The detectives took Evan's statement seriously. They contacted the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, where Prosecutor Linda Vargas began preparing charges. Investigators obtained search warrants for the Harrington Scott residence, seizing computers, phones, and personal items. Forensic analysis revealed explicit materials and communication logs that corroborated Evan's timeline. Witness interviews from church members and neighbors painted a picture of a controlling household, one where Evan was rarely alone or allowed to socialize freely. On October 15, 2019, Michael Harrington and Daniel Scott were arrested in the church parking lot moments before a Wednesday evening Bible study. The arrest stunned the congregation. Some refused to believe it, insisting Evan must be mistaken. Others felt a deep sense of betrayal, recalling moments when they dismissed small red flags. During interrogation, Michael maintained his innocence, claiming Evan was confused and trying to destroy the family. Daniel mostly stayed silent, occasionally shaking his head. But with mounting evidence, their denials carried little weight. The trial began in March 2021. Due to the high-profile nature of the case, it was held under tight security. The courtroom was packed, journalists, church members, and advocacy groups filled the seats. Evan testified for nearly 5 hours, detailing the abuse and explaining how manipulation kept him silent for so long. His testimony was emotional but steady, a sign of his determination to be heard. Prosecutor Linda Vargas presented digital evidence, expert testimony on grooming behaviors, and forensic reports that confirmed abuse. The defense attempted to portray Evan as an unstable young man with a vendetta, but the jury was unconvinced. On April 19, 2021, the jury found Michael Harrington and Daniel Scott guilty on all counts, including aggravated criminal sexual abuse, criminal sexual assault, and abuse of authority. Judge Patricia Reynolds delivered a life sentence without parole for both men. In her closing remarks, she said, "You exploited your roles as parents and community leaders to commit acts that will haunt this young man for the rest of his life. Society must be protected from individuals who hide behind positions of trust to commit such harm." Evan, now in his early 20s, lives outside Chicago. He has changed his name for privacy and is working with a non-profit organization that supports survivors of abuse. The church underwent significant restructuring, removing both men's names and revising its leadership policies. But the scars left on the community remain. This case is a sobering reminder that abuse can happen anywhere, even in the most trusted spaces. Titles, reputations, and outward appearances can mask dangerous truths. Evan's courage in stepping forward not only brought his abusers to justice but also exposed the importance of believing survivors, no matter who the accused might be. What measures do you think should be in place to ensure that children and young adults in religious or community care are safe from abuse by those in power? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you believe stories like Evan's must be told, subscribe to this channel and share this video. Every view, every share, and every conversation brings awareness, and awareness is the first step toward prevention.